Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a document today that, on the surface, sounds like something exclusively reserved for the deepest, darkest corners of a corporate accounting department.
It really does.
Right. We are looking at an ISACA guideline specifically detailing information technology audit sampling. But before you touch that dial, you need to understand what this document actually represents. We aren't here to read a manual to you. We're here to tear down the strategic playbook for how human beings verify truth in an environment where data is effectively infinite.
Exactly. It is the ultimate intersection of raw, overwhelming digital reality and rigorous, time-tested methodology. If we connect this to the bigger picture, imagine a high-tech, globally distributed data command center. Millions of transactions, access logs, system changes, they're firing off every single second.
Just a constant stream.
Right. Now, overlay that with the meticulous, highly skeptical mindset of a classic investigator. That is where IT audit sampling lives. Because in a world where data generation never stops, trying to audit every single digital event is just a mathematical and physical impossibility. Sampling is the art and the science of finding the absolute truth in a sea of noise without drowning in the process.
And that is exactly why we're dedicating this entire deep dive to unpacking this specific methodology. Whether you are prepping for a high-stakes compliance audit or trying to understand how massive tech companies verify their internal security, or maybe you're just intensely curious about how, facts are constructed and validated in our digital age, this is the mental shortcut you need.
It really is a superpower once you grasp it.
Yeah. So we're going to walk through this sequentially, Chapter 2 of the guidelines. We will start with the fundamental rules of engagement, what sampling actually is, and the specific scenarios where attempting it is a catastrophic mistake.
Red flags.
Exactly. From there, we will move into designing the architecture of a sample. Then, the actual mechanics of selecting the data, the highly pressurized moment of evaluating the results, and finally, the rigid standards for documenting the entire operation so it survives hostile scrutiny.
It's a rigorous journey, but it is the only way to build actual confidence in a digital system. You have to start by accepting the reality of our modern limitations. We have to completely shatter the myth that an auditor or even an advanced auditing team can review 100% of the information generated by a modern enterprise system.
It's a persistent myth, isn't it?
It is, but in almost all practical scenarios, it's a delusion. You are immediately constrained by time, by human capital, by computational resources, and honestly, by the sheer crushing volume of data.
Let's put some scale to that volume. If we are looking at a multinational cloud provider, we aren't talking about a spreadsheet with 10,000 rows. We are talking about billions of server interactions a day.
Billions.
If you attempt to review 100% of those logs, you're going to induce organizational paralysis.
And even if you somehow had the infinite computing power to analyze that entire ocean of data, you run headfirst into a secondary, often fatal constraint.
Which is?
Timeliness. Let's say you decide to pull an entire year's worth of firewall configuration logs, and you dedicate the next 6 months to analyzing every single line of code. By the time you issue your final report, your conclusions are based on a system architecture that ceased to exist 5 months ago.
Wow, yeah.
Modern systems are dynamic. They updated yesterday, they patched a vulnerability this morning. Drawing absolute conclusions based on deeply outdated data is functionally useless when it comes to assessing current operational risk.
That raises a difficult question, though. If the system updated this morning, doesn't that mean any data we pull today is immediately obsolete by tomorrow? How does sampling actually solve that problem of the moving target?
It solves it through agility. By carefully extracting a representative subset of data, a sample, you can analyze it, evaluate the risk, and deliver a conclusion in a matter of days or weeks rather than months. You are trading the impossible goal of absolute comprehensive review for the highly practical goal of precise, mathematically sound estimation.
You get a snapshot.
Precisely. You are capturing a highly accurate snapshot of the current state of the system, which allows management to make decisions that actually matter today.
So if we accept that looking at everything is a fool's errand, we have to choose our extraction weapon very carefully. The methodology lays out 4 distinct paths for reaching these appropriate conclusions. Let's break these down, starting with statistical sampling. This is the one most people are vaguely familiar with, I think.
Right, the math-heavy approach.
Yeah, probability-based selection. It relies purely on the laws of mathematics. If an auditor needs to review a year's worth of employee access changes, they might use a statistical algorithm to randomly select exactly 200 of those changes. Because the selection is mathematically random, the auditor can evaluate those 200 items and use the results to estimate the error rate for the entire year, complete with a strict confidence interval.
That is the purely mathematical approach. But the second path, non-statistical sampling, moves entirely away from mathematical probability. This approach relies almost exclusively on the auditor's professional judgment and their specific knowledge of the environment. You aren't randomly picking items. You are intentionally targeting items based on known risks, materiality, or historical blind spots.
But wait, doesn't relying purely on a human auditor's judgment introduce massive bias into the equation? If I'm just picking the files that look suspicious to me, or the files from a department I don't trust, how is that scientifically valid? Are we just finding what we want to find?
This raises an important question about the fundamental goal of an audit. Sometimes introducing human bias, or more accurately, targeted human skepticism, is exactly the point. In certain scenarios, random math is actually a liability.
How so?
For instance, if you are auditing a network for potential malicious activity, randomly picking user accounts is highly inefficient. The vast majority of users are just checking their email and doing standard work. Instead, an auditor will use non-statistical sampling to specifically zero in on the highly privileged administrator accounts.
Oh, I see.
You review all the changes made by the 5 people who actually hold the keys to the kingdom. You ignore the standard users because the systemic danger is concentrated at the top. It isn't mathematically representative of the whole company, but it targets the highest concentration of risk.
I see the distinction. You aren't trying to describe the whole forest. You are specifically checking the trees closest to the power lines.
That's a great way to put it.
That leads us to the third method, which involves bringing in the heavy digital artillery, data-driven sampling. This is where auditors leverage advanced analytics and automated data interrogation tools. Instead of looking at a small subset, you ingest the entire massive data set, say 10 million financial transactions, and you write scripts to scan every single one of them.
But you aren't doing it manually.
Right, no human could.
Yeah.
You program the software to flag bizarre outliers,
Right.
illogical date sequences, or unauthorized geographic locations. You let the algorithm find the anomalies.
What's fascinating here is how these 3 distinct methods naturally evolve into the fourth and often most powerful option, the hybrid approach. Modern auditing rarely relies on a single tool. You combine them to maximize both efficiency and the depth of assurance.
Give me a concrete scenario of how that layering works in practice.
Let's say you are auditing a global procurement system, millions of purchase orders. First, you deploy a data-driven analytical routine to scan the entire database. You program the tool to isolate any purchase order that was created, approved, and paid by the exact same user within a 24-hour window.
That is a massive red flag for fraud.
Huge red flag. The analytics tool scans the 10 million records and isolates a subset of 5,000 high-risk transactions.
Okay, so you use the analytics as a dragnet to shrink the ocean down to a manageable lake.
Exactly. But 5,000 is still too many to manually review under a tight deadline. So you transition to the second layer.
Yeah.
You take that high-risk pool of 5,000 and you apply a strict statistical sampling method to randomly select 100 of them for deep manual document-by-document review. You used analytics to find the highest risk strata, and then you use statistical math to pull a defensible representative sample from that specific danger zone.
That is incredibly elegant. It is like using satellite imaging to find a specific storm system and then dropping a weather balloon right into the center of it to measure the barometric pressure.
Precisely.
But, as rigorous as these methods are, the ISACA framework is equally obsessed with knowing when to walk away. Identifying the scenarios where attempting to sample is fundamentally inappropriate. What are the red flags that tell an auditor to stop before they even begin?
The first and perhaps most absolute red flag is evidence limitation. If the system logs are corrupted, if data is inexplicably missing, or if the underlying logic used to extract the data from the database is flawed, you cannot proceed. Sampling requires a pristine population.
Because if it's flawed,
If you pull a sample from a corrupted dataset, your mathematically sound extrapolation is just projecting garbage across the entire enterprise.
garbage in, mathematically verified garbage out.
Precisely. If you cannot absolutely guarantee the integrity of the data pool, sampling is entirely off the table. The second red flag appears when automation alternatives already exist. If an organization has implemented continuous auditing tools, or if there is a deeply embedded system control that automatically validates 100% of the transactions in real time, Pulling a manual sample is a massive step backward.
Right. If a modern email server has a built-in automated filter that scans every single inbound message for malware, an auditor doesn't need to manually pull a random sample of 500 emails to see if they contain viruses. The machine is already doing it comprehensively. You would audit the configuration of the filter itself, not sample the emails.
That's the exact distinction. The third scenario where sampling fails relates to the physical characteristics of the population itself. This usually manifests in two extremes. On one end, the population is simply too small. If a company only executed 15 major contract modifications over the entire year, designing a complex statistical sample to review 5 of them is an absurd waste of time. You just review all 15.
And the other extreme.
The other extreme is a population that is so violently unstable or continuously shifting that you cannot draw a boundary around it. Think of a real-time stream of unstructured network traffic. If you cannot reliably freeze the environment to define a static population, you cannot mathematically sample it using traditional methods.
Which brings us to a red flag that I think trips up a lot of organizations: the high risk and compliance barrier. There are certain operations where the margin for error is absolutely zero. If a single failure in a specific IT control could result in a $100 million regulatory fine or trigger a catastrophic breach of highly classified customer data, leaving the verification of that control up to statistical probability is reckless.
It is entirely unjustifiable. In those ultra-high-risk scenarios, management and regulators demand absolute certainty, not a 95% confidence interval. Furthermore, if a specific legal statute or a rigid regulatory framework explicitly demands 100% verification of a certain class of transactions, the auditor's hands are tied. You cannot sample your way out of a legal mandate.
So we have established the perimeter. We know the constraints, we know the 4 extraction methods, and we know exactly when to refuse the engagement. Now we move into the actual architecture of the process. This is the blueprint phase. And we need to spend a significant amount of time here because this is where audits are fundamentally won or lost. If the design is flawed, the execution doesn't matter.
The blueprint phase is where the strategic alignment happens. You don't just open a database and start running randomizing scripts. You have to align the design of your sample directly with the overarching objectives of the audit and the specific risk profile of the environment. You begin by clearly defining the purpose of the test. What exactly are we trying to prove or disprove? From there, you have to develop a granular understanding of the population you are targeting.
And understanding the population isn't just about knowing how many rows are in the database. The guidelines are adamant that you have to account for systemic behavioral quirks. You must factor in the existence of extreme outliers. You have to design the sample to account for very small, exceptionally rare adverse events that might get swallowed up in a purely random poll. You even have to factor in chronology and seasonality.
Seasonality is a massive blind spot for inexperienced teams. Think about a global retail logistics system. The transactional volume, the system stress, and the user behavior in that system during the 3rd week of November are radically different than in the 2nd week of March.
Black Friday versus a random Tuesday in spring.
Exactly. If your sample design blindly pulls data evenly across the entire year, it will inherently underrepresent the unique risks, system degradations, and chaotic errors that only occur during the peak holiday surge. Your design must intentionally account for that reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because as we talk about designing these tests, we have to split the entire concept of sampling into 2 completely different universes: compliance testing versus substantive testing. If you don't understand the difference between these two, you cannot design a valid sample. Let's build a scenario to tease these apart. Imagine a highly secure, heavily fortified bank vault.
A perfect foundational analogy. Let's walk through it.
Okay, so in this scenario, compliance testing is focusing entirely on the security apparatus itself. We are testing the control. Is the heavily armed security guard at the front door actually stopping every single person, checking their cryptographic ID and logging their entry? We aren't looking at what is inside the vault. We are exclusively testing whether the defensive mechanism, the control, is functioning exactly as designed.
And because you are testing a mechanism, the type of sample you use is highly specific. For compliance testing, you utilize what is known as attribute sampling. You are looking for a binary reality. It is a yes or no question. Did the security guard check the ID? Yes or no? Did the system force the user to change their password after 90 days? Yes or no? Was the financial wire transfer cryptographically signed by a senior vice president? Yes or no? You are sampling the population to determine the rate of deviation. How often did the control fail to execute its specific attribute?
Right, it's binary. The guard either checked the badge or they didn't. But substantive testing is an entirely different mission. If compliance testing is watching the guard, substantive testing is walking straight past the guard, opening the massive steel door of the vault, and physically counting the gold bars to ensure the physical reality matches the numbers on the bank's ledger. You are no longer testing the defense, you are testing the actual substance, the underlying data itself.
And because the mission changes, the mathematical tool must change. You cannot use attribute sampling to count gold bars. For substantive testing, you shift to variable sampling. The sampling unit is no longer a binary yes or no, it is a quantitative measurement. You are measuring monetary values, database row counts, or physical inventory balances. You're trying to determine the actual financial or quantitative impact of any misstatements within that population.
Let's push this scenario a bit further to really cement why you need both. What happens if you only run a compliance test and the security guard is absolutely flawless? They check every badge every time. You sign off on the control. But if you never run a substantive test, you would never realize that the vault itself was emptied out 3 weeks ago by someone who actually had a valid badge.
That is the danger of relying solely on control testing. The mechanism worked perfectly, but the underlying data, the substance, was completely compromised. Conversely, if you only run a substantive test, you might count the gold bars, find that the ledger is perfectly accurate, and sign off. But without a compliance test, you wouldn't realize that the security guard has been asleep for 3 days, and the only reason the gold is still there is pure luck. A comprehensive audit design recognizes that attribute sampling and variable sampling answer 2 halves of the same risk equation.
So we've established our goals and our sampling types. But before we pull a single piece of data, we have to talk about the data pool itself, defining the population. And the guidelines are terrifyingly strict about the integrity of this step. You have to validate the system parameters, the extraction scripts, and the report filters. You have to prove definitively the data you are looking at is actually the data you think you are looking at.
Population integrity is paramount. A common failure point is a subtle error in the date logic of an extraction query. An auditor intends to pull all system access logs for the entire fiscal year. But because of a time zone configuration error in the script, the pull quietly excludes the final 12 hours of December 31st. The auditor doesn't notice. They run their complex statistical models, pull their samples, and issue a clean report. But they completely missed a massive, unauthorized data exfiltration that occurred at 10 p.m. on New Year's Eve. If the population is flawed, the sample is blind.
Once you have mathematically proven that your population is complete and accurate, you can deploy one of the most powerful optimization techniques in the blueprint, stratification. This is where you stop treating the population as a massive, homogeneous blob of data.
Stratification is the application of intelligent architecture to raw data. It involves dividing a massive, highly diverse population into smaller, logical, mutually exclusive subpopulations, or strata. The absolute foundational rule here is that every single item in the total population must belong to one and only one stratum. There can be no overlap and no item can be left out.
Let's give this some texture. If we're auditing all 10,000 user accounts in a corporate network, treating them all as equal risks is incredibly inefficient. So we stratify. We build buckets. We take all the highly privileged IT infrastructure administrators and put them in bucket A. We take all the automated service accounts, the applications that talk to other applications without human intervention, and put them in bucket B. We take all the standard everyday employee accounts and put them in bucket C. We have just stratified the population based on access rights.
And the strategic advantage of doing that is purely risk-based efficiency. Stratification allows the auditor to dynamically allocate their resources. Bucket A, those IT administrators, represents massive systemic risk. One compromised admin account can bring down the company. So, the auditor might design a sample that tests 50% or even 100% of the accounts in Bucket A. Meanwhile, Bucket C, the standard employees, represents a much lower individual risk. The auditor can apply a much smaller, purely statistical sample to Bucket C. You have drastically reduced your overall manual testing time while simultaneously increasing your microscopic focus on the areas that actually matter.
It is the definition of working smarter, not harder. But even with the most brilliant stratification, anytime you choose not to look at 100% of the data, you are inviting a ghost into the room. You are accepting risk. The framework spends a lot of time mapping out the danger zone, sampling risk. Because your sample is only a fraction of the whole, there is a mathematical possibility that the fraction you randomly selected does not truly represent the reality of the larger population.
The guidelines break this mathematical anxiety down into two very distinct, very terrifying types of risk. The first is the risk of incorrect acceptance. This is the absolute nightmare scenario for an auditor. This occurs when you pull a sample, you test it rigorously, and every single item in that sample passes with flying colors. The sample looks pristine. Based on that evidence, you formally conclude that the system is secure and the data is reliable.
But the reality is completely different.
Exactly. The reality is that the broader population is actually riddled with material errors, systemic fraud, or massive security vulnerabilities. You just happen to mathematically stumble into the only clean pocket of data in the entire system. You accepted a broken environment, you provided a false sense of security to the board of directors, and you sign your name to a disaster.
That is the career-ending risk. But there is a flip side to that coin. The second type of risk is the risk of incorrect rejection. This is the inverse. You pull a sample, and it is an absolute disaster. It is full of errors, misconfigurations, and deviations. You sound the alarm, you write a blistering audit report, and you declare the entire system fundamentally broken.
And in this scenario, the broader population is actually perfectly healthy. By a stroke of incredibly bad mathematical luck, your random sample managed to pick up nearly every single isolated error that existed in the system. You hit the reverse lottery.
So what does this all mean in terms of impact? If incorrect acceptance gets you fired, what does incorrect rejection do?
Incorrect rejection rarely leads to an ultimate audit failure because the immediate response to a failed test is usually management pushback and expanded testing. The danger of incorrect rejection is the catastrophic waste of organizational resources. You force entire engineering teams to drop their critical projects and spend hundreds of hours hunting for a systemic flaw that doesn't actually exist. You destroy trust between the audit function and the operational teams.
Okay, let's slow down and build a scenario for how we actually manage these risks, because the framework explicitly links this back to the granddaddy of all auditing concepts, the audit risk model. This is where the theoretical math meets the real-world environment. The model is an equation balancing three specific types of risk: inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk.
If we want to understand how this dictates our sample size, we have to isolate those variables. Let's imagine we are auditing a high-frequency cryptocurrency exchange. The very nature of that business, moving millions of dollars of irreversible digital assets in milliseconds across global borders, means the inherent risk is astronomically high. The environment is naturally radioactive, prone to attack, and highly susceptible to catastrophic loss regardless of what defenses are in place.
Okay, inherent risk is off the charts. Now we look at the defenses.
That is the control risk. We assess the exchange's specific internal security measures. Are their firewalls robust? Is their cold storage protocol cryptographically sound? Let's say we do our preliminary walkthrough and realize their change management process is sloppy and developers are pushing code directly to production without peer review. The control risk is therefore also assessed as very high. The defenses are porous.
So we have a highly radioactive environment surrounded by a very leaky lead shield. As the auditor, I am stepping into a fundamentally dangerous situation.
Which means your detection risk, the risk that you, the auditor, fail to find the massive errors that are almost certainly happening, must be driven down to the absolute lowest possible level. You cannot accept any ambiguity. To drive detection risk down, you must drastically manipulate your sample design. You cannot rely on a small, high-level sample. You must demand massive sample sizes, demand exceptionally high confidence levels in your statistical map, or entirely abandon manual sampling in favor of comprehensive, data-driven analytical scans of the entire transaction ledger. The environment forces your hand.
But if we flip the scenario, say we're auditing the cafeteria payroll system at a small regional hospital, the inherent risk of material financial collapse is incredibly low. The control risk is also low because they use a massive standardized third-party payroll provider with automated guardrails. In that scenario, I can accept a much higher detection risk. I can use a smaller, highly targeted, stratified sample because the environment simply isn't radioactive. I don't need a lead suit, I just need a standard thermometer.
That is the exact dynamic balancing act of the audit risk model, which leads us perfectly into the mathematical tension of the next phase, balancing tolerable error versus expected error. This is a crucial, often misunderstood relationship that directly dictates how many items you actually have to pull.
Let's define the boundaries. Tolerable error is the absolute maximum amount of mess, deviation, or financial misstatement we can accept in a population before we are forced to formally conclude that the system has failed. If we are doing compliance testing on our security guard, the tolerable error is the maximum deviation rate. Can we tolerate a 5% failure rate? If he forgets to check 1 out of 20 IDs, is the building still reasonably secure? If it crosses to 6%, the control fails.
That establishes your ceiling. But before you calculate your sample size, you have to realistically estimate your expected error. This is the amount of mess you actually anticipate finding in the population before you even run the first test. You don't guess this, you calculate it based on historical precedent.
Did this specific department fail this exact audit last year? Have they experienced massive staff turnover? Did they just migrate to a brand new cloud architecture 3 months ago?
Oh, new system migrations are an auditor's dream, or nightmare, depending on how you look at it. There are always transitional errors. If they just migrated, your expected error rate shoots up. Exactly. And the mathematical relationship between the ceiling tolerable error and your baseline expected error is the engine that generates your sample size. If your tolerable error is 5% and your expected error is effectively 0% because the environment is historically pristine, you have a massive mathematical cushion. You can afford a relatively small sample size to prove that the true error rate isn't going to suddenly jump all the way to 5%.
But let's squeeze that cushion. What if the tolerable error is still 5%, but because of that messy system migration, you calculate an expected error of 4%? You know you are walking into a disaster zone.
If the gap between what you expect to find and what you can tolerate is incredibly narrow, your sample size must dynamically and massively increase. You need a mathematically enormous sample to confidently prove that the 4% mess you expect to find isn't actually a 5.1% mess in reality. If the margins are razor thin, you need an overwhelming amount of evidence to prove you haven't crossed the red line.
That makes perfect sense. The closer you are to the cliff edge, the more precise your measurements need to be to prove you haven't fallen over. Okay, we are rounding out the blueprint section of the framework by exploring some of the advanced tactics. These are the tools that elevate a standard audit into a highly optimized, modern assurance engagement. First, the guidelines explicitly authorize the use of dual-purpose samples.
This is a tremendous efficiency hack. Historically, auditors would pull one specific sample to test compliance watching the security guard and an entirely separate sample to test substantive data counting the vault. Dual-purpose sampling is the rigorous design of a single, unified sample that allows the auditor to evaluate both the control attribute and the substantive variable simultaneously on the exact same data points. It essentially cuts the extraction and processing time in half, provided the statistical design can support both mathematical requirements.
The framework also pushes heavily into continuous assurance. We touched on this earlier when discussing when not to sample. If you are operating in an environment characterized by massively high data volumes, deeply embedded automated controls, and highly reliable structured data streams, think of the back-end payment processing engine for a major credit card network. Traditional sampling is archaic. You don't pull 50 transactions. You design real-time monitoring scripts that sit on the network layer and evaluate 100% of the transactions as they occur, flagging anomalies instantly. You transition from periodic sampling to continuous observation.
What's fascinating here is how that push for continuous, comprehensive analysis inevitably leads to the deployment of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the audit design phase. The ISACA guidelines acknowledge that we are entering an era where AI can ingest billions of rows of historical system behavior, identify complex, multidimensional clusters of risk that no human being could ever visualize, and use those insights to direct the auditor exactly where to point their targeted samples.
But the framework is not giving auditors a blank check to just plug an LLM into their database and blindly follow its instructions. There are massive, rigid guardrails around this. The text insists on deep technical and governance constraints when using AI for sampling.
And rightfully so. You are legally and professionally bound by the principles of responsible AI deployment. One of the most critical concepts here is monitoring for model drift. Let's say you build a highly advanced machine learning model to help you sample for fraudulent wire transfers. You train that model on 5 years of historical fraud data from 2018 to 2023. The model becomes exceptionally good at finding the specific tactics hackers used during those years.
But hackers don't stand still.
Exactly. By 2026, the threat actors have entirely changed their methodology. They're using deepfakes, complex localized routing, and new cryptographic exploits. If your AI model hasn't been continuously updated and retrained on the new behavioral parameters, it will suffer from model drift. It will continue designing perfectly optimized samples to catch the fraud of 2023 while remaining completely blind to the fraud happening right now. The auditor must technically validate that the AI's logic has not drifted away from the current reality of the risk environment.
And even if the model is perfectly updated, there is an even bigger hurdle: explainability. This part of the text really stood out to me. If I am an auditor and I use a complex billion-parameter neural network to analyze a database, and the AI spits out a list of exactly 200 highly anomalous transactions for me to test, how do I put that in my work papers?
You have hit on the fundamental tension between advanced technology and auditing standards. The black box problem. The absolute non-negotiable standard of an audit is that the methodology must be traceable and reproducible. If the AI is a black box and it just says test these 200 items, and you cannot mathematically or logically explain why it chose those specific items over the other 10 million, you have lost your audit trail.
If I can't explain the logic, I have no evidence. I just have a machine's opinion.
Precisely. The guidelines require that if you use AI to design or select a sample, you must document the AI's overarching logic, the specific parameters it was constrained by, the provenance of the data it was trained on, and the specific risk thresholds it applied. Another human professional must be able to look at your documentation, understand the algorithmic guardrails you established, and agree that the resulting sample is a logical output of those specific parameters.
And just like that, we have survived the blueprint phase. We have our purpose, our strata, our mathematically balanced risk models, and our AI guardrails. We are now moving into the third major phase of our deep dive: making the cut. This is the actual execution of the selection, pulling the data from the wild.
And this phase begins with a stark warning about maintaining absolute control over the extraction process to ensure representativeness. We touched on extraction logic earlier, but the danger of bias here is profound. An auditor can never, under any circumstances, simply ask the department they are auditing to run a report and send over the data.
Right. You can't let the entity being investigated define the boundaries of the investigation. If I ask a deeply stressed IT manager to give me a list of system changes to review, human nature dictates that they're consciously or subconsciously going to run a report that excludes the catastrophic server crash from last Tuesday.
Exactly. The auditor must either personally write and execute the extraction query against the database, or they must directly observe the database administrator running an auditor-approved script. And once that data is pulled, before a single sample item is selected, that extracted dataset must be rigorously reconciled back to the authoritative source system. If the financial ledger says there are 100,000 transactions for the month, and your extracted dataset only contains 99,000, your selection process stops immediately until that discrepancy is mathematically resolved.
Okay, so we have secured our pristine, verified dataset. Now we have to actually pick the items. We debated the theoretical differences between statistical and non-statistical sampling earlier, but now we need to look at the mechanical execution of those theories. Let's start by laying out the statistical playbook. These are the tools where every single item in the population has a known, non-zero mathematical probability of being selected.
The most foundational tool in that playbook is simple random sampling. It is exactly what it sounds like. You use a cryptographic random number generator to select items from the population. Every single item, whether it's a $1 expense report or a $1 million invoice, has the exact same equal mathematical chance of being selected. It is the purest form of unbiased selection.
Next is systematic sampling. This is highly efficient when dealing with massive ordered lists. You determine a fixed mathematical interval, say every 250th item. You use a randomizer to pick a starting point within the first interval, say item number 42. Then you just march down the list, pulling item 42, then item 292, then item 542, and so on. It guarantees an even distribution across the entire chronology of the population.
And we already explored the mechanics of stratified random sampling, where you break the population into distinct risk buckets first, and then apply simple random or systematic selection strictly within the boundaries of each individual bucket.
Now, compare that rigorous math to the non-statistical playbook. This is where human judgment takes the wheel. The first method here is haphazard sampling. This sounds terrible, but it has a specific use case. This is an informal selection process where the auditor isn't using a mathematical randomizer, but they're actively attempting to avoid any conscious bias. They might be doing a physical walkthrough of a data center and haphazardly ask to see the maintenance logs for 3 random server racks they happen to walk past.
It is useful for quick, preliminary pulse checks, but it provides very low analytical assurance. The far more powerful non-statistical tool is judgmental sampling. This is the targeted sniper rifle we discussed earlier. You aren't avoiding bias. You are heavily applying it based on your expertise. You are specifically hunting for known vulnerabilities, testing high-value transactions, or focusing exclusively on users with a history of compliance violations.
So what does this all mean when we get to the end of the test? Here's the absolute golden rule of this entire section. The mathematical boundary you cannot cross. You cannot extrapolate non-statistical results to the whole population, period.
It is a critical limitation. Let's say you use judgmental sampling to specifically pull the 20 riskiest, most complex, multi-currency vendor contracts in the database. You test them, and you find that 10 of them contain severe authorization errors. You have a 50% failure rate in your sample. Because you intentionally targeted the highest risk items, you cannot take that 50% failure rate and mathematically project it across the other 50,000 standard low-risk contracts in the system. Your conclusion is absolute, but it is strictly limited to the specific 20 items you investigated. You proved those 10 are broken, but you proved nothing about the macro environment.
If you want to project to the macro environment, you have to use the statistical math. And within that mathematical realm, the guidelines make a fascinating distinction between selecting by records versus selecting by quantitative fields. Selecting by records is what we've mostly been talking about. Each row in the database, each invoice, each user account is treated as a single equal unit. Invoice A has the same chance of being picked as invoice B.
But treating every record equally is a massive vulnerability when you are dealing with extreme financial disparities. If a company processes 100,000 invoices a month, and 99,000 of them are for $20 office supplies, but 1,000 of them are for $10 million infrastructure acquisitions, a simple random sample of records is almost guaranteed to fill your sample with $20 office supplies. You might completely miss the massive financial risks simply because they are outnumbered.
This is where we introduce one of the most brilliant concepts in the entire framework, MUS, or monetary unit sampling. This flips the architecture of the sample entirely. You aren't picking random invoices anymore. You're essentially picking random dollars.
Let's visualize how this mechanically works. Imagine you take every single invoice generated in a year and you lay them end to end to create a massive physical timeline on the ground, scaled exactly to their dollar amount. A $20 invoice takes up exactly 1 inch of space on that timeline. A $10 million invoice takes up several miles of space.
Okay, I have a timeline that stretches across the state.
Now, you use your randomizing software to blindly throw mathematical darts at that massive timeline. If a dart lands on a specific inch, the auditor must pull and review the entire invoice that contains that specific dollar. Because the $10 million invoice takes up miles of space, it is mathematically almost guaranteed to be hit by multiple darts. It will absolutely be selected for review. Because the $20 invoice only takes up an inch, it has an infinitesimally small chance of being hit.
That is incredible. The logic inherently and automatically biases the selection toward the transactions with the highest material impact, while still maintaining strict statistical randomness based on the dollar unit. It guarantees you are focusing on the catastrophic financial risks.
It is an incredibly elegant solution to the problem of materiality. But as we rely more heavily on these brilliant mathematical solutions, we fall into what the guidelines frame as the technology trap. We are trusting specialized software and automated scripts to throw those mathematical darts. The framework demands that auditors ask a very paranoid question. What if the software doing the sampling is fundamentally broken?
What if your randomizer isn't actually random?
Exactly. If you were using a Python script to generate a simple random sample from 1 million rows of data, how do you know the script's pseudo-random number generator isn't biased toward odd numbers? Or what if it simply ignores the last 10% of the database due to an array indexing error?
You have to audit the auditor's tools.
You must independently validate the logic of the tool itself. But beyond that, you have to ensure reproducibility. When a computer generates random numbers, it uses a starting point called a seed value. The guidelines explicitly mandate that auditors must document and retain the specific seed values used during the selection process. If you, or a regulator, or a hostile defense attorney needs to rerun your exact script 3 years later, inputting that documented seed value will force the computer to generate the exact same random sample again, proving your work wasn't manipulated after the fact.
That level of paranoia is necessary, especially when we move the entire operation into the cloud. The framework dedicates specific guidance to cloud environments. And honestly, trying to sample the modern cloud sounds like an auditor's absolute worst nightmare. The cloud is a constantly moving target. It is ephemeral. We have auto-scaling environments using Kubernetes where a specific server container might spin up, execute 1 million transactions, and completely delete itself out of existence all within 14 seconds. How on earth do you apply a traditional sample to a physical server that only existed for 14 seconds?
You cannot rely on traditional physical state auditing. You have to freeze time. The guidelines dictate that in these highly dynamic ephemeral environments, auditors must rely on capturing stable, cryptographically time-stamped snapshots. You aren't auditing the live server. You are defining your population as the exact state of the configuration at a specific frozen second. You extract that frozen snapshot into a secure, offline environment, and you run your sampling methodology against that stasis.
But there is a massive political and architectural hurdle there. Often, major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, Google, will flat out refuse to give a client's auditor direct access to their back-end hypervisor logs or infrastructure configurations. They consider it a severe security risk to their multi-tenant environment. If the provider physically blocks your access, you cannot pull a snapshot. You cannot sample directly. Do you just issue a failure report and give up?
No. The audit must continue, but the pathway changes. The framework explicitly outlines the requirement for alternative assurance in these scenarios. If the direct path is blocked by cloud architecture, the auditor must secure independent third-party validation. This most commonly takes the form of SOC reports, Service Organization Control reports.
These are the reports issued by the massive audit firms that do have special vetted access to the cloud provider's backend.
Exactly. The auditor must obtain these independent reports, rigorously evaluate the scope to ensure it covers the specific cloud services the client is using, and rely on that third-party testing to satisfy their own sampling requirements. Alternatively, the auditor might pull configuration data through heavily secured read-only APIs provided by the cloud vendor, assuming the integrity of those APIs can be independently verified. You have to find a highly secure, mathematically defensible side door when the front door is locked.
All right, the side door is open, the snapshots are taken, and the data is pulled. We have survived the execution phase. Everyone take a deep breath because we are heading into the crucible. Section 4, the moment of truth, evaluating the results. The massive planning phase is over, the data extraction is complete, the manual testing is finished, we have our sample, we have run our test, and we found errors. Now what do we do?
Now, we perform the real analytical work of an auditor. The guidelines emphasize that we do not simply count the errors, calculate a percentage, and drop a number on a page. Every single deviation, every single error found in that sample must be subjected to a rigorous root cause analysis.
You have to understand the why, not just the what.
Exactly. The nature of the error dictates the entire risk profile. Let's say you are reviewing a sample of 50 expense reports and you find 3 errors where the total amount was calculated incorrectly. Are those 3 errors the result of a tired, overworked employee accidentally typing a 6 instead of an 8? That is an isolated human error. It is bad, but it isn't systemic.
But what if the root cause isn't human? What if you trace those 3 errors back and realize that the automated calculation logic within the expense software itself has a catastrophic rounding error when dealing with foreign currency conversions?
Then the risk profile explodes. That is no longer an isolated typo. That is a systemic algorithmic flaw. If the software is broken, it means every single foreign currency expense report processed by the entire company over the last year is likely mathematically incorrect. The root cause analysis transforms a minor sample deviation into a massive, enterprise-wide financial restatement. You have to understand the origin to understand the blast radius.
And speaking of blast radius, this section includes a highly practical rule that I think every auditor wishes they could use more often. I call it the pull-the-plug rule.
Ah, yes, the threshold for early termination.
If you design a brilliant sample of 100 items and you sit down to start testing and the first 5 items you look at are completely hopelessly broken, they violate every single control rule, it is immediately obvious that the system is fundamentally failing on every level. The guidelines state that the auditor can use their professional judgment to just pull the plug, stop testing entirely.
It is a rule born of pure pragmatism. The fundamental objective of the sample is to gather sufficient appropriate evidence to form a conclusion about whether a control is effective. If the first 5 items demonstrate catastrophic systemic failure, sufficient evidence already exists to conclude the objective has not been met. The control is dead. Why waste another 3 weeks of expensive audit hours documenting exactly how many times the dead control failed? Document the early findings, formally declare the material weakness, and force management to immediately pivot toward remediation rather than further investigation.
It is efficient ruthlessness.
Right.
But let's look at a much more frustrating scenario. What happens when you don't find a blatant error, but rather you find nothing at all? The framework has very strict rules regarding missing evidence. Let's say you randomly selected a critical network firewall change to test. You ask for the digital approval ticket that authorized the change, and the IT department says, sorry, we migrated our ticketing system last month, and that specific record seems to have been lost in the transfer. It is just gone.
That happens more often than you'd think.
Can't the auditor just throw that specific item back into the pool, run the randomizer again, and pick a new replacement item that actually has documentation?
Absolutely not. That is the definition of analytical cheating. You cannot artificially manipulate your sample by discarding the difficult items. If the evidence is missing, the framework demands that the auditor must exhaust all possible alternative procedures to gather that specific evidence.
What does an alternative procedure look like in that scenario?
If the primary digital ticket is gone, the auditor must dig deeper. Can we find a secondary email chain between the engineer and the security director discussing and approving the change? Can we pull the direct server access logs from that exact timestamp to see who physically executed the code? Can we formally interview the personnel involved and secure sworn attestations? You must attempt to reconstruct the truth through secondary channels.
And if all those secondary channels are dead ends, if the evidence is truly permanently vaporized,
then the framework is unforgiving. If you cannot independently verify that the control occurred through alternative means, that missing item must be treated mathematically as an error, a complete deviation. You must assume the control failed because you cannot prove it succeeded.
that is tough, but mathematically necessary. Which brings us to the most pressurized moment in the entire evaluation, extrapolation. We touched on this rule earlier, but it is the fulcrum of the entire audit.
It is a moment where we project our localized findings onto the macro reality, and the text rigidly enforces the divide between methodologies. If you utilized a strict statistical sampling design and your deep analysis reveals a 2% error rate within your sample, you now apply complex mathematical formulas factoring in your pre-calculated sampling risk and confidence intervals to project that error rate across the entire population of millions of rows.
You are mathematically estimating the total damage.
Yes. But if you utilize non-statistical methods, if you used your human judgment to purposefully hunt down the highest risk items, you must stop immediately. You describe the devastating errors you found in those specific targeted items. You provide deep contextual analysis for management, but you do not project. You cannot calculate a total population error rate based on a biased sample.
Which brings us to the final call, the climax of the entire operation. This is where the auditor must make the hard business decision. You take your statistically projected population error, let's say, after all the math. You project that the true error rate in the environment is 4.2%. You take that projected number and you slam it against the tolerable error ceiling that you firmly established way back in the blueprint phase.
And let's say your tolerable error threshold, the absolute maximum deviation the business can survive before the system is considered compromised, was set at 3%.
So we have a projected reality of 4.2% and a hard limit of 3%. We've crossed the red line.
The projection exceeds the tolerable limit. The sample has mathematically proven that the environment is unacceptable. At this exact moment, the entire risk assessment of the audit must be reevaluated. The auditor cannot simply sign off. A critical decision tree opens up. Do we expand the testing? Do we pull a massive secondary sample to see if a larger data set brings the projected error rate back down below the 3% threshold?
Or maybe the initial expected error calculation was flawed and we need to deploy entirely different data-driven analytical procedures to map the exact boundaries of the failure.
Or, if the evidence is overwhelming, the auditor must make the ultimate hard call. They must officially fail the control environment. They must draft a formal finding of material weakness, present it to the executive board, and trigger massive, potentially highly disruptive remediation efforts across the enterprise. This is the moment where theoretical sampling math forces a highly consequential, real-world business decision.
And whatever catastrophic decision you force that board to make, you had better be able to mathematically and procedurally defend every single step that led you to that conclusion. Which perfectly segues into our fifth and final section of the framework, getting it in writing, the documentation phase. There's an old, deeply ingrained saying in the auditing profession, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen.
It is the absolute law of the land. The guidelines break down exactly what must be contained within the final work papers. And it is crucial to understand that audit documentation is not just a spreadsheet listing the errors you found. It is the comprehensive, unbroken narrative story of the entire engagement.
You have to document the initial objectives. You have to clearly define the population parameters and mathematically prove how you validated that extraction. You must document your expected and tolerable error calculations. You must record the exact sampling intervals used, the specific cryptographic seed logic for your randomizers, and provide a deeply written rationale for every single professional judgment call you made along the way.
The ultimate, uncompromising test of this documentation is the standard of reproducibility. The framework states that another qualified, experienced IT auditor who has zero prior knowledge of your specific engagement and was not in the room with you should be able to pick up your final work papers, follow your exact documented steps, run your specific extraction scripts, apply your documented seed values, and arrive at the exact same mathematical conclusion. If they cannot seamlessly reproduce your work solely from reading your notes, your documentation has failed the professional standard.
And we must highlight a massive modern evolution the framework introduces here regarding the documentation of automated tools and AI. 10 years ago, an auditor just had to write down their manual steps. Today, if you deploy a machine learning script or an AI agent to analyze the database and pull the sample, the burden of documentation expands exponentially.
The machine's work must be scrutinized and recorded just as rigorously as the humans. You must document the specific version of the algorithmic tool used. You must document the exact computational environment it ran within. You must record the specific parameters and constraints programmed into the AI, and you must retain any underlying data visualizations, decision trees, or analytical dashboards that the tool generated to support its output. If the AI made a decision, the documentation must capture the logic behind that decision to satisfy the explainability requirement we discussed earlier. The audit trail must extend deep into the machine's architecture.
It is a massive paradigm shift in how digital reality is recorded. Finally, the guidelines close out this entire strategic framework with a mandate for continuous improvement. The text insists that the science of auditing is not static. It is a constantly evolving arms race. After the final report is signed and the engagement is officially over, the audit team is not allowed to simply file the work papers and walk away.
Practitioners are explicitly expected to conduct rigorous post-mortem reviews of their own methodology. They must sit down and ruthlessly ask, did our complex sample design actually work efficiently? Did our stratification model accurately isolate the true risks, or did we waste hundreds of hours testing the wrong buckets?
You have to audit the audit.
Exactly. Furthermore, they are encouraged to constantly calibrate their internal methodologies against broader, evolving global frameworks like COBIT or the NIST cybersecurity standards. And crucially, as technology accelerates, audit teams are expected to continuously consult with specialized data scientists and AI governance experts. They must actively figure out how to integrate new analytical capabilities to make their next sampling design even sharper, faster, and more aggressively accurate. It is a professional mandate to continuously evolve your skepticism and your technical capability.
And there we have it. We have systematically torn down and decoded Chapter 2 of the ISACA ITAF Companion Performance Guidelines. Let's briefly summarize this massive journey. We started by aggressively accepting the absolute limitations of modern computing, the reality that we simply cannot review an infinite ocean of data. From that point of surrender, we learned how to architect a bulletproof, mathematically sound blueprint, carefully balancing the radioactive risk of the environment against our expected errors and tolerable thresholds. We explored how to physically extract that data without introducing human bias, how to leverage monetary unit sampling to target massive financial impact, how to evaluate the inevitable systemic errors without panicking, and finally, how to document that entire complex process so that it is utterly airtight, explainable, and reproducible by anyone.
And if we connect this massive technical teardown back to the bigger picture, why does this matter to you? We live in an era defined by overwhelming information overload, wildly manipulated statistics, and dubious, unverified claims made by massive corporations, autonomous algorithms, and public figures alike. Understanding the rigorous, uncompromising mechanics of how expert investigators actually sample and test data gives you a profound superpower. You now possess the mental architecture to ask the devastatingly right questions.
When someone confidently presents you with a verified fact, an audited metric, or an AI-generated conclusion, you no longer have to blindly accept it. You know exactly where the weak points are. You know to ask, what were the exact parameters of the population? Did you use statistical math or biased human judgment? Did you actually account for the terrifying risk of incorrect acceptance? How did you document the algorithmic logic of the AI that pulled this data? You now understand the skeletal structure behind how truth is actually constructed and mathematically defended in the modern digital age.
It is the ultimate intellectual defense mechanism.
It is a superpower indeed. But before we let you go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It builds on everything we've debated today, but it looks just over the technological horizon. As we rapidly move into an era of true quantum computing machines that can process complex, multidimensional data sets at speeds that shatter our current understanding of physics, paired with hyper-advanced AI that can instantly evaluate billions of records without breaking a sweat, will the very concept of sampling eventually become a relic of the past? Will quantum processing finally allow us to achieve that impossible myth of 100% real-time verification of every single digital event? Or will the sheer volume of our digital populations, the astronomical explosion of human and machine data creation, just grow so unimaginably massive that the ocean will always outpace the processor, meaning we will always need the brilliant mathematical art of finding the needle in the cosmic haystack?
It is the ultimate technological paradox. A perpetual arms race between our infinite capacity to generate data and our finite ability to comprehend it.
Something fascinating to think about the next time you look at a massive spreadsheet or read a verified report. Thank you so much for joining us for this strategic teardown. We hope you walk away equipped with a sharper, far more skeptical lens on the digital world. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning the parameters, and keep learning.